The Manhattan skyline is changing, down the west side at least, as the massive Hudson Yards urban renewal project is well on the way. Marianne Kwok is design director at Kohn Pedersen Fox and was there from the start of the project. I spoke with her on the sidelines of the Urban Task Force gathering in Sydney today. Marianne Kwok, this Hudson Yards project, it's the most expensive urban renewal project in North America?
In North America.
Tell us a bit about it.
It's 28 acres, 14 acres, which has to be open space.
Sitting on Manhattan?
Sitting on a rail yard, a working rail yard. And so this huge rail yard is right adjacent to the Hudson River. And it really was a black hole in the city. It separated the city from the river and Chelsea to the south from Hell's Kitchen to the north. And so by building a platform over the rails, and it really has stitched the city back together, north-south, and also has enabled the city to have access to the water.
How important for the business model of the project was the railway station, Penn Station?
Well, it's not really Penn Station because that's always there and it's right close by, but it's really the extension of the number 7 line, a subway. And the extension of that obviously is enormously important for workers and for businesses thinking of moving.
And that actually happened before the current owner-developers actually took it on, is that right?
It is. Initially, they were planning to have the Jets Stadium on the western. It's basically 2 large blocks, and so on the western block, right next to the river, they were thinking of having a stadium for the New York Jets, a football team. And that stadium was also going to be the New York's 2012 Olympic bid.
Yeah, why did that fall over?
Well, you can imagine. People just hated the idea of it. The idea of a stadium that wasn't going to be used that much, parking, traffic, it just wasn't popular. But while the stadium was being proposed, they rezoned the whole area. And that rezoning also necessitated the subway because in case there was the Olympics, people had to get there.
So when the current developer, related company, came on board, what were you, as the planner, looking to create?
Well, we wanted to create New York's next neighborhood, and that's the goal of the developer as well.
And what sort of different uses do you have, and are you developing?
We have pretty much everything. There's residential, there's office, there's retail, there's a school, there's a hospital, hotels, pretty much lots of open space, plaza as well as parks, large art, cultural venue.
And what drives the returns for the owners? What's the engine? Is it the residential side? Is it the retail side?
I think it's all of it. Obviously not the green space, not the public space, but the offices are fully leased, and residential, one tower is being sold, and the second one is coming onto market.
So you've nearly finished these 2 great towers.
We have almost finished our 2 office towers, and the residential towers, not by KPF, by SOM and Diller Scofidio Renfro with the Rockwell Group, are almost complete as well.
Right, okay. Now, they are 2 enormous towers now that I can see on the skyline. Presumably they're not loved by everybody. I mean, how do you deal with local community concerns that is taking away from the sort of culture, the old culture of the area?
There really was no culture in that area, so we were lucky there. And also the skyline of New York is undergoing so much change right now. Currently, I think the city skyline hasn't changed since maybe the 20s or 30s, and so it's a really exciting time for New York. Less visible, perhaps, are the new parks, the renovation of existing parks, pedestrianized streets, bike lanes, all sorts of urban things that make living in New York so much more exciting.
People talk about affordable housing. I mean, this doesn't sound like affordable housing to me.
20% of the apartments will be affordable. Of course, it's an issue.
And what about the balance between the developer risk, the money spent by the developer, and the money spent by the taxpayer? Because, I mean, some articles, one article I've read even suggested that it might be $4.5 billion worth of taxpayers' money in Hudson's Yards.
Oh.
Well, in various things, in city capture expenditures, I think they throw in the extension of the train line, general tax breaks, that sort of thing.
I think the train line is paid for by taxes of the new rezoning. So they upzone the area, meaning that there's more density, and that the owners of those pieces of land will contribute to the paying off of the number 7 line.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you're looking at these urban renewal projects, one of the questions is how much should be funded by taxpayers and how much of it should be a developer play?
I believe that the city contributed to things around the area, but not for Hudson Yards at all. That is fully paid for by Related and financing that they got.
Once Hudson Yards is up and running fully, how much of a flow do you see within the city? I mean, are other parts of the city going to lose out to population and living?
I think the west side of Manhattan is really exciting, and for a number of different reasons, but I think a major catalyst was the High Line. And the High Line really has generated a lot of new architecture along the west side. And
when you say the High Line, just explain to everyone what that is.
Oh, the High Line was an elevated rail line that was unused, abandoned, and they have made a city park out of it.
It's a great walkway that you've got.
It's really incredible, and so there's a lot of art galleries along it, new architecture, and I think it brings people to the west side, and I think the far west side has not really had visitors before, and it's very open, and being near the river, it's a wonderful place to be.
Marianne Kwok, it sounds a big and fascinating project. Thanks very much for sharing it with us.
Thank you.
Well, after the break, talking local urban renewal with the CEO of Urban Task Force, Chris Johnson, and Raul Mittal from Urbis, Singapore and Kuala Lumpur.
You're watching Tiki on Your Money.
Welcome back. Well, let's stick with this challenge of urban renewal, where a lot of money is going to be spent, but this time in Sydney, where population growth and immigration levels caused the Premier of New South Wales, Gladys Berejiklian, this week to call for a breather while infrastructure caught up. Well, that was received with dismay by the Urban Task Force, including Chief Executive Chris Johnson. So what should Sydney be doing to solve housing and living challenges? I sat down with Mr Johnson and also Raul Mittal from Urbis. Chris Johnson, let me come to you first, because the Premier's comments recently about halving the immigration rate into Sydney, perhaps by 50%, we all need to have a breather because infrastructure can't keep up.
Well, she's wrong. She's wrong in that only in March this year, 2018, she put out the biggest plans for Sydney's next 40 years of growth that we've ever had. And it was an integrated plan. It had land use planning, it had transport planning and infrastructure planning. So she set out a plan only 6 months ago for the way forward.
But the backflip? Why the backflip then?
Because there's an election coming up, there's tension about growth and change, as inevitably happens. As a city grows, there's going to be tension. At the moment, we've got 30%, according to 2016 census, of people living in apartments. That wasn't the case a decade or two ago. This is changing the nature of the city from a low-rise suburban city to a more urban city. And some people are worried about that, but it's the inevitability of change. If we are going to grow as a city, the other option is to pull up the bridge, stop growth, and go backwards perhaps. That's not going to help the best jobs coming to Sydney. It's not going to help us in our international standing. It's not going to get more tourists into the city. And it's not going to get a good supply of jobs flowing through the whole community. And this is at a very time when the baby boomer ageing population is moving through the demographic charts to produce less people earning income.
Raoul, you're at Sistra in Singapore. I think that's City Strategies. We hear that Singapore is maybe 10, 20, 30 years ahead of Sydney. In what way?
So we were discussing earlier with Chris that Sydney and Singapore have the same population. Sydney has a bit more area than Singapore. We're only a small island of 700 square kilometers, but our density that we live at is almost 20 times of what Sydney lives at. But you don't feel it on the street. There's still in excess of 30% green coverage. There's wonderful parks, beautiful riverfronts and waterfronts. So it is possible to do high density with high livability.
So it is in the planning?
It is in the planning, and that's the only way Singapore can survive, because we're a very small island and we house 5.5 million. We're projected to grow up to 7 million people in Singapore.
Chris, what do you think new urban renewal developments in Sydney must have?
2 or 3 things. One, I think a city as it grows from our 5 up to 8 million or so needs much better public transport. We need a metro system. The same thing that Singapore's got, the same thing London, New York have got. A good underground metro subway system that gets people off the cars and off the roads travelling to work. Once we've got that, we need the density related to those stations along the way. And the plus of that for those concerned about growth and change is it actually protects probably 70, 80, 90% even of the suburban low-rise part of Sydney.
So, Raoul, just tell me about the train system in Singapore, because I think you're working on a major development on the train side right now.
That's right. So I think I totally agree with you, Chris. The Singapore is doubling its rail network. We're going from 180 kilometers of rail that already exists to 360 kilometers. We're opening new lines, completely new lines, new stations. But again, we're doing it on the backs of putting density next to stations. So people really want to live in these TOD developments that we call, right next to the station. They want to be able to jump on a train, drop their kids to school, go to a place of work, come back in the evening and enjoy as much time as possible with their family.
Well, Chris, just coming back to the Premier's comments, isn't this putting the cart before the horse? Don't we have to have the rail system first?
Well, there's always a chicken and egg, because part of the new development contributes funds back into the infrastructure costs. So if you say, let's have no...
So that's the value capture side?
It's a value capture, but there are whole lots of levies that come with new development. And so it helps actually make it happen. So if you actually had no new development, put all the rail system in, everyone would say it's a white elephant, there's no people there, where is it? And you've lost the potential to get some of that into it. So I think we've got to move in an iterative way, where we're encouraging a certain amount of development along with the future rail system that's going to occur. And that way we get a win-win.
What are the sort of big projects that you're looking at in Sydney at the moment?
Well, there's some good examples. I think Central Park, the project on Broadway, is very close to Central Railway Station, close to universities and buses. It's got a number of towers covered in greenery and landscape, which looks fabulous, and that helps the image of the whole place. But it's got its own park, it's got its own health centre, it's got its own shopping centre, it's got childcare centres, it's got a whole lot of facilities. So people have got all the amenities they want there. It's also got 60 go-get cars in the basement, so people don't need their own car. So this is becoming a more sharing approach to how you live, encouraging people to walk and to use all these facilities instead of having all of it in their own little house.
And Raoul, what do you think of these 2 enormous renewal projects that are being done internationally at the moment? Firstly, Battersea Power Station in London, and then also Hudson Yards in Manhattan.
I think they're wonderful projects. Both cities are grappling with the same urban issues that we're grappling with in Australia and in Asia. So brownfield redevelopment is the way to go forward, and these are very substantial projects, and what they're trying to do is give not only land back to a more productive use, but also connect cities back to their waterfront. So wonderful examples, and wish we had more brownfield land in Singapore, which we could recycle like that.
Yes, it's all spanking new up there. Chris, interesting that with these new projects that it's actually the private sector putting in the money.
Well, I think there's a shift from governments doing all the infrastructure. I mean, in the old days, the government would put all the roads in, the schools, the preschools, the whole parks and everything for the public domain. the taxation base is not allowing that to happen these days.
There's plenty of incentives, though. I mean, just looking at the New York example, I think there was some controversial tax incentives there. Do you still see this sort of thing happening?
Well, there has to be some incentive for a developer to contribute that back. So they've got to work out the cost of the land, the building, the development, etc., what can be contributed to provide what governments used to provide. And it's a balancing act. Generally it means higher buildings, more density than we used to have. But that's the trade-off. And the beauty, I think, of taller buildings is it actually opens up more space at ground level. So you can actually get more parks. I think Hudson Yard's got 3 parks. And a series of a school even, childcare, restaurants, shops, people living there, people working there. It's a whole little town in its own right. And because it's a big site, you can design it in a way to get the height where it does the best for the whole site, so you don't overshadow the park, for instance. So bigger sites, I think, are the way forward.
Raoul, how do you make an urban regeneration which looks maybe bright lights and concrete? How do you make it full of soul?
Yeah, I think that's a very tricky proposition, and I think what we're starting to see in Singapore now is something we call intergenerational living. So Singapore's got an aging population. At the same time, we've got a falling birth rate. So what the planning agency and the public housing authority are looking at is this co-living, intergenerational living, where you've got retirees living in the same community where there's childcare. So in essence, the younger couples who are both working, they can drop off the kids at the childcare. The grandparents can pick them up after childcare, take them up to their unit, feed them dinner, play with them, interact with them. So the grandparents feel happy. The parents are happy because the children are taken care of and the children are getting rooted more in the community. So I think that's we're starting to see a lot more of that interaction happen, which is fabulous.
Oh, look, I agree. I think that you need design quality first. You need a good quality development, but there are economics about that. So if the approval authority pushes down the amount of development, the developer, to make it all work, is going to have to cut a few corners. You've got to allow enough development that you can do a really good job. The schemes we're talking about, Battersea Park has got Norman Foster, it's got Frank Gehry, world's top architects involved, similar in Hudson Yards.
And are you optimistic for Sydney?
I am. The Central Park one I mentioned has got Jean Nouvel, a French architect. We've got a British architect down at Barangaroo. We've got, but local architects as well. So we've got to encourage local architects. I think there's too much regulation and control, quite frankly, at the moment in our planning system, which stops innovation. We need real innovation from the private sector, from our architects, to do something quite spectacular.
Chris Johnston, Raoul Mattel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.